Welcome to this video on expressions versus equations. Let's begin. First of all, let's figure out what is the main difference between expressions and equations. And the really simple answer is that equations contain an equal sign, whereas expressions do not contain an equal sign. So before we fill in the rest of this chart, let's just list some basic examples of expressions versus equations. So take the number 2. 2 is an expression. Right? The number 1/2 is also an expression. If I have 2x plus 3, that's also an expression. If I have 1/2 plus 1/3, that's also an expression. I could also have, 2x plus 3 minus 5. Okay? So all of these are just different examples of expressions. Okay? And notice that none of them have an equal sign. Okay, so let's look at examples of equations. So an equation, right, would be maybe like 2 is equal to x, or I could have 2x plus 3 is equal to 5, or maybe I have 1/2 plus 1/3 is equal to x. So again, notice in all of these, I actually have an equal sign. So the reason this is so important is because it determines what you can do to them, and specifically what you can multiply them by. Okay, so if I have any of these expressions here, right, I can simplify them. Okay, and sometimes they're already fully simplified, right? There is no way to simplify this guy or this guy or this guy. They have already been completely simplified. However, I could simplify this expression, and I could simplify that expression by combining like terms. Another thing that you can sometimes do is you can evaluate expressions. So in other words, if I told you, hey, x is equal to 1, right, I could evaluate 2x plus 3 by substituting 1 in for x. So that's something else that I can do with expressions. The one thing that you cannot do, and it's very important, is that you cannot solve expressions. Right? Because there's nothing to solve. So I think of expressions almost like an incomplete sentence. That's kind of the metaphor I use. So an incomplete sentence would be like, on Tuesday, right? Well, there's nothing to unpack there. Like, what happened on Tuesday? I need more information, right? Like if I say, hey, I have a problem on Tuesday, and then I stop talking, right? Or, I don't know, we're on the phone and the line cuts out. Right? I can't help you. I can't solve your problem because I don't have all the information. So that's like an expression. With an equation, right, it's a complete thought. So like that would be like, I have a problem on Tuesday. I booked 2 meetings at the same time, right? Okay, now you have enough information. Now you can help me solve it, right? So same thing over here with an equation. So for example, 2 equals x, right? Well, I have all the information I need. I know that x is 2. Over here, 2x plus 3 is equal to 5. Well, I don't know what x is, but, right, I can move things around until I find out what x is. Same thing down here, 1/2 plus 1/3 is equal to x. Again, I don't know what x is yet, but I can find out. Okay? So again, with expressions, you can simplify them, you can evaluate them, but you cannot solve them. With equations, you can, and in fact, usually should, solve them. Okay, so that's expressions versus equations. And then the big thing, and the thing that confuses many people, is what can you do to them, right? In other words, take the expression 1/2 plus 1/3, right? Let's look at that. So as you know, that these are 2 fractions that we're trying to add together. But I can't add across, right? 1/2 plus 1/3 is not equal to 1 plus 1 over 2 plus 3. Right? So remember, for fractions, when we're going to add them together, what we have to do is we have to get a common denominator. And you may or may not recall, we do that by multiplying 1/2 by 3 over 3, which is going to give us 3/6. And we multiply 1/3 by 2 over 2, which is going to give us 2/6. Now that we have a common denominator, right, I would have 3/6 plus 2/6. Well, 3 plus 2 is 5. So that's going to give me 5 over 6. So let's unpack what we just did there, and let's think about why we can do what we did, right? What we multiplied by is, over here, 3 over 3. But what is 3 over 3? Well, anything divided by itself is just 1. So anytime you're working with an expression, not an equation, but an expression, the only thing that you can do, or that you can multiply by, is 1. You cannot multiply by anything else. And let me just prove that to you, right? So for example, let's take the number 2. right? If I multiplied 2 by, for example, 3, right? Well, that would be 6. That would actually change the numerical value of 2, wouldn't it? Right? So 2 isn't 2 anymore. Likewise, if I think about, the number 1/2, right? What if I tried to multiply 1/2 by 2? Well, 1/2 times 2, well, that's equal to 1. So again, I can't do that because it's changing the value of that number. If I want to preserve the information and preserve the value, the only thing I can multiply by is 1. Because why? Because anytime you multiply by 1, anything by 1, it doesn't change the value, right? 1 times 2 is 2. Right? 1 times 1/2 is 1/2, right? 2x plus 3 all times 1 is just 2x plus 3. So anytime I multiply by 1, I am not changing the value of that thing. So again, when you have an expression, the only thing you can multiply by is 1. Multiply by anything else and it's illegal. You're changing the value of that expression. You're losing the information. Okay? So again, you can only multiply by 1. If we come over on the other side with equations, so for example, let's take 2x plus 3 is equal to 5, right? So this is a two-step equation. We could solve it by subtracting 3 from both sides. So we have 2x is equal to 5 minus 3. 5 minus 3 is 2. And then we would divide both sides by 2 to get x equals 1. Okay, so let's think about what we just did. Well, we subtracted 3 from both sides, right? Couldn't do that with an expression. Can't subtract 3. And then we divided by 2, or if you want to think about it, we multiply by 1/2. Okay? So remember, with equations, you can literally do anything you want to the equation as long as you do it to both sides. So when I say, what can you multiply it by? The answer is anything as long as you do it to both sides of the equation. Okay? You can also add anything you want, right? You could add something to both sides. You can subtract something, right? You can do anything you want to the equation as long as you're doing the same thing to both sides. So what I want to do now is a little bit different. Normally we solve one problem at a time because, that's just a normal way to do things. But this time I actually want to sort of look at two problems side by side. Okay, so on the left side we have 1/2 plus 1/3. On the other side we have 1/2 plus 1/3 equals 1/6 plus x. Okay, so even though this might be a little bit simplistic, I want to think about what can we do to the left side, what can we do to the right side. Okay, so as you can see, the left side is an expression. So the only thing I can multiply over here on the left side is what? Is 1. So remember, when we add fractions, we have to get a common denominator. So the least common denominator is 6. So I'm going to multiply 1/2 by 3 over 3. And again, the reason I can do that is because 3 over 3 is just 1. And when I multiply anything by 1, it doesn't change the value of that thing. Okay, so remember, when we multiply fractions, it's really easy. It's the easiest thing we do with fractions. We just multiply across. So we have 3 times 1 is 3, and then we have 3 times 2 is 6. Notice that 3 over 6 is the same as 1/2, isn't it? If I eat 3/6 of a pizza, it's the same as eating 1/2 of the pizza. Okay, 1/3. Again, we want to multiply by 1, right? But again, we're trying to change the denominator, get a common denominator. So we actually multiply by 2 over 2. But 2 over 2 is 1. So we have 1 times 2 is 2, and then we have 3 times 2, which is 6. So now that I have a common denominator, I can add. So I have 3 plus 2 is equal to 5, and I have 5 over 6. So 1/2 plus 1/3 is equal to 5/6. Again, remember that this is an expression, not an equation. So the only thing I was allowed to do was I was allowed to multiply by 1. I was not allowed to do anything else. Okay. So on the other side, I'm going to take what I already did, if that's okay with you. Right? We already did 1/2 plus 1/3, didn't we? Right? But we have 1/2 plus 1/3 is equal to 1/6 plus x. So what I could do, right, is I could do 1/2 plus 1/3, and we could say, oh, well, that's 5/6. We already know that. Okay, and then I could subtract 1/6 from both sides, and I could get 4/6 is equal to x, and then we know that 4/6 reduces to 2/3. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. But let's say I hadn't thought about it that way, right? Let's just say that I'm staring at this big, ugly, scary equation. Okay, so first of all, let's make a note that this is an equation, right? This is not an expression, it's an equation. So I can do anything I want to as long as I do it to both sides of the equation. So in this case, the most helpful thing that I can do is to find and then multiply by the LCD. Okay, so I have a whole video on finding the LCD, so if you need to go back and watch that, that's fine. But I'm just going to tell you right now that the LCD of this equation is 6, the least common denominator. So what I can do is I can multiply this whole equation by 6. So let's see what that's going to look like. Okay, so I'm going to go times 6, times 6, times 6, times 6. Okay, so let's simplify this. 6 times 1 is 6, so we have 6 over 2 plus 6 over 3 equals 6 over 6 plus 6x. Okay, now we just have a bunch of division. Well, 6 divided by 2 is 3, 6 divided by 3 is 2, 6 divided by 6 is 1, and then 6x is just 6x. So now, all of a sudden, I have this much nicer equation, right? I have 3 plus 2, which is 5, equals 1 plus 6x. So this is a much easier problem for me to solve because all of the fractions are now gone. So I can just subtract 1 from both sides. I get 4 is equal to 6x. I divide both sides by 6, and we get x is equal to 4 over 6, which of course we have to reduce, and that gives us 2/3. Okay, so again, it's very, very, very important that you understand when we are working with an expression, okay, I can't multiply by any old thing that we want. We can only multiply by 1. However, when we have an equation, right, I don't have to go through all that nasty mess of having a common denominator because instead, if I just multiply by the LCD, right, as soon as I do that, then I get to this part where there are no fractions anymore.